Okay, so let's talk just very, very briefly about why validity matters. We've kind of already mentioned that a couple times over, and this last section is going to be pretty much optional. I'm going to give you 2 or 3 more examples on why validity is so important. A long time ago, doctors used bloodletting to treat patients. Bloodletting was the practice of cutting someone open and letting some of their blood drain out. The idea was that this would give the body a chance to get rid of the bad stuff in your body. So, is bloodletting a reliable or valid medical practice? Well, let's think about this. Is bloodletting valid? They're not sure, but they gave all of their patients a bloodletting treatment, and some of them died and some of them didn't. But the ones that didn't die had gotten a bloodletting treatment, so they said, oh, well, if I did bloodletting on you and you got better, that means that bloodletting is good. But that's a mistake. First, it's not very reliable because they're ignoring the people that they gave bloodletting to and that did not survive. So, because they're ignoring some of the data, they are um, making a mistake in reliability. Maybe the people that they saw over and over again were the ones who lived, and therefore they thought reliability matters, or bloodletting is reliable. Another way to think about this is this test valid? They thought of validity just in terms of did they get better or not. But they didn't really do a good job of thinking what happens when I do this bloodletting? Does the patient get worse in any sort of way? Does his blood pressure fluctuate? Does his does his body struggle more? They didn't really have any good way of measuring if this was valid or not. So, one of the ways to be careful about reliability and validity is to make sure that you have good comparison groups. Those bloodletting examples have lacks a good comparison group because they didn't give anybody a nothing treatment. Right? You always want to have a control group in your research, so maybe give half of your patients bloodletting and half of your patients nothing, and see if which group has the more healthier patients after a month or a couple of years. We've talked about these sort of issues before. If you say that your parents taught you well, and your parents taught you by hitting you when you did something wrong, and you think, well, that's a good way to teach children because I turned out okay, you have kind of a mistake there because you don't have a comparison group. There's no way to assess whether that's a good way of raising children because what you would have to do is have like an identical twin that was raised with different parents that didn't hit them and see if they came out better or happier. Another thing to be wary about is that research should eliminate confounds. Confounds, once again, are anything that can confuse the results that you have. For example, dying would be a confound on checking whether bloodletting works because you wouldn't get any more data on the person who dies. There are a couple videos here. If you'd like to check them out, I would encourage you because they do a good job of describing confounds or situations where people don't have comparison groups. This one here on the right is really exciting to me. He's famous for a book called Freakonomics. One of the things that he did was he would talk to different people, and he was kind of a statistician, so he would try and figure out how do we do better in business. And so one day he gets recruited to help out a car sales company, and so he asks, well, what are you doing to advertise your cars? And they said, well, we put newspaper ads in the newspaper, and that's how we advertise our cars, and we're really happy with those newspaper ads because they work really, really well. And so he goes, okay, well, how do you know they work really well? And he said, well, We know they work really well because we always put them in the newspaper and we always get lots of sales. And so you have a problem here. How can we know that it works well if you don't have an example of the opposite or the alternative where you're checking for that comparison group? What happens when you don't have newspaper ads? And so he goes, have you ever skipped a week just to see what happens, just to see if the newspaper ads are really making people buy more cars? And they go, no, there's no way we could ever do that because we're afraid that we wouldn't sell as many cars. And so he says, okay, well, if you don't want to stop the newspaper ads, have you ever had a time when you didn't have the newspaper ads? Maybe we could look at that data. And they go, well, we did have an intern one time, and he tried to do that, and we fired him because he stopped putting the newspaper ads for a week. And so he goes, oh gosh. And he looks at the data from the time when that kid or that guy stopped doing the newspaper ads just for a week, and he noticed that when you accounted for all of the different variables, the newspaper ads were actually costing them more money than they earned. They were actually, yes, they were selling more cars, but the number of cars they were selling was so little compared to the price of doing those newspaper ads that it just was not worth it. And so that's a situation where he has the comparison group, so he was able to eliminate the confound. What other confounds might there be in this study? Well, he mentions that there are more car sales in winter time, especially New Year's and Christmas, because people are buying gifts, because people's cars break down more often in winter time, because people have more money, they get their Christmas bonuses. And so that was something that could make it difficult to assess whether the newspaper ads were working or not. So those confounds. You notice that the newspaper ads were less effective during major political time because the newspaper was more exciting to look at the news stories about politics than the ads about the cars. And so there you have your confounds. And an important note to have here is that you want to control for those confounds. You want to, like I said in those previous slides, you want to avoid those affecting whatever you're trying to research. But another thing to be worried about is the fact that research is always going to be probabilistic. What that means is that when you do research, you're never going to get super perfect consistent results. In psychology, every idea that we come up with and every result that we get is always going to be there's always going to be exceptions in situations where it doesn't make sense. Most girls are shorter than most boys, but some girls are taller than some boys. And so we have to be careful about those things. We want to be careful about controlling for confounds. We want to make sure that we have comparison groups, but you always want to be aware that no research is going to be perfect because of those confounds, but also because people are consistent in an inconsistent way. Sorry, other way around. People are inconsistently, you know what I mean. Anyway, I hope this makes a lot of sense to you, and I hope it's exciting. I'd really encourage you to check out some of these videos. You don't have to watch the whole video, but you'll get interesting ideas or views into ways in which you could kind of be more reliable or valid by learning about the stories that these guys tell you. And I'd really encourage you to think about the stories in terms of reliability and validity, maybe in terms of those other subtypes that we talked about so far. Okay, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.